I was just saying to Dave that when Margaret came through and said there's been some really good feedback on Gary's talk tonight, and I went, "What, tonight?" I thought it was tomorrow. So I had it in my head it was Wednesday. So what a clot. Anyway, I have seen it. So we have seen the presentation. So it's very good, Gary.
It's good to be recorded.
It was a bit of a ramble, but not to worry.
For a Pollock Shieldsian, it was even fascinating. I may do one for old Pollock Shields.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Yes.
George, I think we're ready to go just whenever you are.
Right. Well, look, why don't we go and I'll just begin to ramble. Probably a wee bit of background. The role that I fulfilled on the project was as project manager, which is basically, it's the person who theoretically is the link between the client, who was Glasgow City Council or Glasgow Life as it became during the project, I think, and the rest of the team. That's the designers and the contractors. This was a rather odd one because we were appointed as the head of a full design team, which meant that it caused some interesting challenges, because if your own team isn't playing very well and your client is telling you your own team isn't playing very well, you have to do something about it. And that's what makes our job a wee bit interesting in that kind of situation. But anyway, that's by the by, really. So with a link between, I would say, link between I and colleagues, not just me, the link between the client and the project team. I'm an architect by training, although I have never, the last thing I designed was the tea room at Logan Botanic Gardens in 1972. And then I fell into project management thereafter. So leave that as it is. So going on to the museum, I was just saying to people before they came on, I met a former colleague who worked as a designer on the project in whenever it was, 16 years ago the project finished. And he was waxing lyrical about how wonderful it was. And that's my memory of the project too, that it was a unique project, and it was just fantastic to work on. Anyway, let's go with the project. So it was designed by John W. Simpson and E.J. Milner Allen. Now, John Simpson was English, and at the time, there was a bit of a furore about this English architect winning this prestigious Scottish commission. Ironically, some 100 years later, I was involved in a similar stooshy when Zaha Hadid was appointed as the architect for the Riverside Museum. The Scottish architectural firmament were not impressed. So we had that to contend with. So nothing really changes in the jealousy of Scottish architects when it comes to things like this. However, you may know that John Simpson was also the architect for Wembley Stadium. So if you remember the historic twin towers of Wembley Stadium, you might see some echoes of Kelvingrove in that. So it was opened in 1901 as part of the Glasgow International Exhibition of that year. Designed to sit in a parkland setting and to lay the myth once and for all, it is not the wrong way around. It was designed to face onto the river, and you'll see it in context in a minute. Now, it's a Spanish Baroque style architecture. So if you can imagine taking the roof off the Grand Hall, that would be the form of it. It would be open air, but obviously you can't really do that in Scotland. So it's an enclosed space. It was partially funded by a previous exhibition in 1888. And this is the 1901 exhibition ongoing. It's worth Googling this if you can, because the building in the distance there stretches from where Kelvingrove is now to almost to, well, it goes over Kelvin Way, and it's a huge construction. So have a look at that. I had hoped to slot in a couple of extra slides, but there's enough on this without anything additional. So there you are, that's it, looking out onto the river. Interesting looking at the drain coming out on the left-hand side. I think they were probably disposing of their sewage into the river in those days, but that's by the by. This one here fascinates me because this is obviously not long after it opened. It's the main court, and it's a sculpture court. But what I see fascinating in this is the sun shafting through the windows and the clouds of dust that are in the air. My interpretation of that is it's the pollution that existed in Glasgow at the time, which ended up damaging the stonework inside, and I'll cover that in a little while. So it was, at the time of closure, the most visited museum outside London, over 1 million people a year, and it was the largest covered venue in Glasgow. So until the hydro came along, I guess, it probably held that prestigious thing. So it's Glasgow's favourite building. And I remember going around before we started the refurbishment, and they had put up a little, almost a memory board. And there was a memory of a little girl talking about being thrown out of the museum for running around in the galleries. And when I told Margaret about it, she said, I could well have been that little girl, because she remembers running around Kelvingrove with her cousin and being thrown out. But there is no doubt that the collection is the building is just a blanket for this astonishing civic art collection. So the objectives were really to improve access. It was to look at deprivation and disadvantage, to try and get a wider audience into the building, and very principally to improve the environment for the collection. So there was a look at this building usage, and one of the things that was discovered was only about 1/3 of visitors ever went up to the first floor. In those days, and Maureen might be able to correct me if I use my terminology wrongly, but the museum was kind of laid out in a fairly rigid way, where there was flat art, and it was classified by the various artistic genres of the time, the Renaissance and Impressionism and all of that, and there was a sculpture court, and there was obviously the dinosaur, and there was the natural history, and they were all fairly sectionalized, I think. Difficulty getting between floors was a problem, and also access to the main galleries themselves. There was no level access. I'm not sure whether orientation and display of the layouts were confusing. Didn't never confuse me, but some people obviously did. So we were trying to make the collection more accessible. Intellectually, now that's an interesting one, because this is where we get into this debate about potentially dumbing down the collection. The approach that Glasgow Life took was to change the emphasis from the objects being standalone objects to being story-based. And the best illustration that I can use for that is, if you go to the museum, you will see the Leonardo painting of the Centurion, and you'll see it juxtaposed with their arms and armor collection. So creating that kind of cross-pollination, I suppose, of two totally disparate strands. So physically it was to be more accessible, and that was done by opening up the ground floor, or what was the basement, the entry level in Kelvingrove Park. So the aim was to increase display space by 35% and try and reinstate some gallery spaces that had been lost and creating new exhibition areas. The aim being to increase the number of objects from 5,000 to 7,500. Again, I can't say whether that was achieved or not. So, cafe, shops and toilets. Toilets being important. Unfortunately, cafes and shops are also important, and some people may argue that that is detrimental. And where you see the cafes spilling out into the Great Hall yeah, I struggle with that a bit. But there's no doubt that we improve the physical access and the circulation by certain means, and I'll show you in a minute how that was achieved. Accretions, this is an expression, a kind of architectural building expression, where during the development of a building, certain things get added in and sometimes they're not very sensitively done. So we took the opportunity to strip out some accretions that were really inappropriate and try to maintain or return the original building into its form. Pardon me. So to be modern style and in sympathy with the building. And there's a couple of examples of that I'll show you. Life expired services. More and more emphasis is placed with museum collections and looking after them. And if you're going to have a traveling exhibition, the requirements for protecting and ensuring these objects is very stringent, and therefore you have to control the conditions of the building. And the building did not meet modern museum standards. There was really no traveling space or space available for traveling exhibitions without major disruption of the permanent collection. So these were the shortfalls. Access to disabled and parent and children wasn't there, the toilets were inadequate, the lift provision was very poor, and the internal appearance was dull and dirty. So we had a programme of the building being closed for 3 years. The resource centre at Nits Hill, which is unfortunately currently closed because of the COVID-19 crisis, it's worth a visit. You can book a visit, or you could book a visit before the COVID-19 thing. And that's where the collection was moved to after we shut for the refurbishment. The only thing that stayed in situ was Roger the elephant. Roger was kept in a big box, and the box had a little door, and inside that door was a little sensor that made sure that Roger was comfortable while we knocked 9 bells out of the building. And it was very successfully done. So Roger the elephant survived the experience very well. There was a 6-month decant period. And of course, as always with projects like this, you have these overlaps where we are busy knocking lumps out of the upper floors of the building while the staff below are still trying to remove the precious artifacts. And there were some interesting near misses associated with that. So for 18 months, the building was under construction or deconstruction or reconstruction, and then a year to fit it out. Now that sounds a long time, but there's a lot of work involved in fitting out and reinstalling the collection. So what did we do then? This is a plan of the building, but with the areas. Can you see this all right? I don't know what you're all watching this on, but it's, I'm going to zoom in on a little bit, I think, if I can. So this is the plan before we've taken anything away. So in this area here, for example, this is a new entrance. So this is the park side here. These are the original stairs up to the ground floor, if you like. So we're entering in through what was the old staff entrance. And all this was a combination of storage and workspaces and things like that. So we were looking at creating a new reception area, a new introductory exhibition space, a shop here, and new toilets here with a temporary exhibition space here. Now the temporary exhibition space was going to be a conditioned space. Therefore you could control humidity, temperature very closely. And that's essential if you're going to bring a priceless work of art from another gallery. This references Solum. The Victorians were great. They built things. This was all filled with stuff, rubbish, soil. And we excavated some of it, but not all of it. Created new plant spaces, but made use of the existing systems within the building because it had a very good ventilation system, albeit it was outdated. So we'll go back to that. So I'll just go to the next one. So this is, as I said, this is how that entrance area was transformed. So we open up this door here. This becomes, instead of a single door, it's a three-panel door. And then with this rotating entrance here, these doors are required for escape. We have a shop, cloaks and reception. So the introductory exhibition here, and then here's the two new stairs up from below to the main hall. New lifts here, new lifts here. This was all very straightforward, and we very creatively inserted these lifts in existing shafts. And Historic Scotland were very heavily involved in this, that we couldn't really do very much to the building without their say-so. And unfortunately, we were unable to measure the building or afford to measure the building very, very accurately before we started. So we were assuming certain things like the entrance to that lift will be rather nicely placed in a bit of wall paneling, and it will fit nicely between pilasters, and therefore we'll get a very neat job. But of course, when you find that the shaft behind doesn't fit where you want it to fit, Historic Scotland come back and say, you can't do it that way. You must not do things like that. So you can, they were challenging at times. So this is the area below. This is the entrance level off of the park. And it's full of all sorts of old rubbish and plant and equipment. Storage, massive. So all this had to be cleared and stripped before we even started doing anything. So if we, again, I'm going to just zoom this a little bit. So if I zoom on that, you'll see that there was the staff entrance. And that's an artist's impression of what we were doing. What we actually did was we put some rather nice stainless steel gates in there by an artist called John Creed. So you see them, they're folded back usually, but they're quite ornate. And then over here, this is where we've just taken off the plaster and exposed all the brickwork. And this was a conscious decision to do this. It wasn't done for cheapness. The architect was very adamant that they wanted to express the structure of the building. So I've mentioned the temporary exhibition and the introductory space, so I won't dwell on that. So as I say, we're cutting away at things and chipping away at things as we go along. And one of the interesting things here, and this is what I expected, this will buffer for a minute or two, but I can talk briefly. The Victorians were great at emphasizing the good stuff, the lovely buildings, the public facing bits, and they spent quite a lot of money on these with their sandstone finishes. But in other areas, they were a bit less fastidious, shall we say. And we were expecting to continue and refurbish this basement area without too much difficulty, building off of the existing slab, except that we found that the existing slab was only about 2 inches thick. So we had to then break all of that out and create new floors at some expense. And these are the kinds of things that you have to expect when you're working on old buildings. This will hopefully, I've had this before, so I know how to get around it. Just a minute. Let's go. Oh no, don't want that. Help. But I'll work my way around this. We'll leave it to, I don't really want to restart the program. I think we're okay. I think. Next. Told you there was a way to do it. So this is the new introductory exhibition. Now this, to me, was the most hideous thing that, I don't know how this, I don't know, Maureen, if you know anything about the background to this, but it was the most awful introduction to a new museum that I've ever come across. But anyway, that fortunately not my role, but it does give this chance to give the public, particularly on the ground floor, as you enter in from the park, an introduction to the museum. And then that is where we have done the transition from below to up. So using some very high quality materials to match the above, we used red sandstone here, it's blunt sandstone up there. The architect originally wanted to use something called Corten steel, which I have a personal aversion to. It's a horrible thing. It's basically rusty metal. And the architect thought it was a great idea, but fortunately we were able to persuade him that that was not a good idea at all. And so you can see, so that was what was cut out, and that was what was reinstated. So the restaurant pavilion's an interesting one, and it's another one where we have some involvement. So the restaurant pavilion is here, and the education suite here. This is the Tom Hunter suite, which was done as a later development or a later fit out after we finished the main building. And this is a centre for innovation and design. It's quite fascinating. But looking at the restaurant, this is what the Victorians, again, were very good at, hiding grotty spaces like that behind walls. We were going to put this is the other side of the entrance, so that it's not strictly the cafe restaurant pavilions. This is where the Tom Hunter section is, but the principle applies. That was what our architects visualized. Now you will see there, if I go, you will see that, this isn't going to do this all the time. You'll see where we have cut down the wall there, where I'm now whirling. And we had a great deal of difficulty with Historic Scotland in convincing them that to make this cafe space work, we needed to do something like this. We had to cut these walls down, and they were very, very anti cutting these walls at all. And the only way we actually got permission to do that, I'll show you what the next slide shows. That is how it came out. So the stonework is cut down, and it's opened this whole thing up. And if you've been in this space, it's probably the nicest space in the museum. Looks out across towards the university. But to get buy-in from Historic Scotland, we actually had to cut out the stone, label it, number it, and have it taken off site and stored. Where exactly it's stored, I could not tell you. It was stored originally at Mary Hill, but I think the Mary Hill place has been disposed of. So that if we ever went back and this was removed, we could reinstate this wall back to the original Victorian configuration. So these were the kinds of challenges we faced as we went along. Another area that we were working on, we were building a conference centre, and the conference centre is below this gallery here. And that's it in progress. So these builders are very clever, And they can do all sorts of interesting things like excavators inside buildings and dig them up to pieces. I remember there's another photograph of this space, and there was the cafe must have been there at one time, because there was a plaque on the wall with the menu on it. So you looked up from this hole up to, and there was, halfway suspended in midair, was the cafe menu. Now, this is an interesting one. This is the reinstated floor above. And I did a bit of research on this because I was on holiday in September of 2004. And I was in Spain, I think, maybe Fuerteventura, or no, where was it? It doesn't matter where I was, but I was abroad. And I got a text from my office, and rather than replying to the text, I phoned the office, and my colleague who took the call said, Kelvingrove has been invaded by Greenpeace. And I said, very good, very good. And they said, no, Greenpeace had invaded it, and they had taken timber out of the building because the timber that was being used by was not Forestry Stewardship Council standard. So it became a bit of a challenge, because we had gone to a company in Holland called Junkers, who provide high quality hardwood floor. The flooring was, the wood was merbau, which is in lieu of Burmese teak, which is what was used in the museum originally, but obviously was very much a protected hardwood that would never be used nowadays. And we thought we had suitable accreditation. And so we were a bit kind of annoyed that Greenpeace should take this action, but it turned out that they were correct. What was happening was that this timber, which we thought was coming from Malaysia and was properly accredited, was actually being logged in Indonesia and was not being harvested in a sustainable manner. So they were right, but it was still an interesting little diversion for us to have the project stopped, albeit for a few days. Mark O'Neill, who Maureen will know well, had to front up and do his diplomatic best, which I'm sure you'll remember. He was a very good diplomat, and he managed to talk Greenpeace round and just persuade them that we had done everything in our power to ensure that the specification was correct. So these are interesting things. So once we go upstairs, there's very little change to the building. We put some toilets in, as you can see, just here, and there's another little shop in the upper level. Finishing kitchen, which is really just to serve a sort of cafe area here. And that's the top of the stairs coming in and lifts emerging. So there was very little change there. And then on top of that, we have the ventilation, because as I said, the ventilation was, we used the existing system and just put in additional plant. But the ventilation plant, again, had to be invisible to the public because of planning constraints. So these were inserted and painted almost the same color as red sandstone. But you'll see that, I mean, we've highlighted these in red just for illustrative purposes, but I think the designers did a really good job in hiding this very important and essential plant. Once we get inside the building, the requirements of modern design and modern museum requires a lot of power and data. Many showcases are lit from inside and need power. Many of them need data to run interactives and other things. So we had to break up the floor and insert all this this plant and power and data cable. Even in the stone floors or the tiled floors. And amazingly, we were actually able to source tiles that were identical to the original ones, so that we did a sort of invisible mending. I have noticed, however, in more recent visits that the tiles have not survived particularly well. But again, it allowed the whole layout of the museum to be much more flexible. Lighting is, I wrote a little note saying that it's a friend and a foe of art. It's light is wonderful for viewing, but it's not so good for protection. So therefore, we had to look at how we could preserve or look after the collection while maintaining a reasonable level of lighting. So the windows were all tinted. They had UV filters on them. They had interstitial blinds, and they had obviously to be sealed, because one of the issues with Kelvingrove before this was it was single glazed, metal framed windows, which were just useless for maintaining the collection. So we have this arrangement where you have an inner leaf, the outer glazing done as per the original, and inside a daylight control blind that allowed us to keep very close control on that. The same applied on the upper levels, where we had to put in, again, solar control. These are horizontal blinds, which can be brought over or left open depending on what is being displayed underneath. LED in the roofs was in a very poor state in some areas. These were actually relatively new LED work that had been done maybe 5 or 6 years previously. But because they had such difficulty getting the LED up, they had used a lower coat of LED, a lighter weight of LED than you would hope to do. And because we had the opportunity to climb, to get up with all our plant and equipment, we could actually replace the LED with the proper material. We also removed the vegetation, as you can see there, which was growing out of the building. A roof was put over the whole of the existing roof to allow us to work in reasonable comfort, if you like, to replace the glazed roof lights. This goes. And this is us now in this here. There's 4 of these, and we were just due to refurbish these, not do very much with them, except that one of them had been affected, and we're not sure why. We think it was perhaps a bomb during the war, but that had twisted badly, and we couldn't afford to dismantle it completely and rebuild it. So instead we tightened it up by putting in some bracing. Stone was repaired, and instead of just being very badly repaired, we cut out some of the stone. And again, Historic Scotland were heavily involved in this and gave us some funding to make sure that we did this as well as we possibly could. So where you see that reference to an indent, that's where we actually cut the stone out, rather than just plastering over with something that looked like stone. So here's how the works were implemented. There's various pictures here of you've seen most of them actually already. And that's the extent to which we, shall we say, stripped the building back. This area here is interesting because the age of the building and the ornateness of that decoration, we could not afford to redo that. And one part of the building in particular had been suffering from water ingress very badly. And we repaired the water ingress, but the damage had been done to the interior finishes. So to get round it, rather than redecorating the whole of the Grand Hall, we employed a set artist, a theatrical artist, to make the damaged paintwork look the same. So where there was dreadful, visible damage, he basically painted it over to make it match the majority of the rest of it. So it looked okay, which was kind of a bit of lateral thinking on somebody's part. It certainly wasn't on mine. This here is interesting. On the left-hand side, this picture here this is on the Argyle Street side. One of the things that we had to do, and I meant to mention it when we had the plans up, was to create a buffer for when objects are brought in from anywhere into the museum. They have to be conditioned before they are actually placed in the gallery. So we had to create a close controlled environment so that the objects come in the back of a transporter. They're moved into this transition space where they are conditioned for then onward transmission for display in the museum. So that was quite a dramatic intervention. As you can see, it's very large piece of plant and equipment. So the building was knocked around a fair bit. We're moving now into the fit out quite briefly. The event communications were the designers for the fit out. And you'll see in that illustration, there was an aeroplane, and that aeroplane ended up suspended from the structure. And this was another wee challenge that we had. The aeroplane has been suspended. It has its engine in it, which makes it a very heavy piece of kit. Normally, or often, such things, the people who suspend them cheat by taking the engine out, but we didn't. And if you look up there, these two props prevent the load of the airplane pulling the whole construction in. So the engineers designed these pressure resisting posts. There'll be a correct expression for that. Compression members to stop the walls coming in. And then a different company came and rigged the wiring to pull the aeroplane up into place. There was a bit of an impasse between the designer of the construction, if you like, and the people who were lifting the aeroplane, because the designers of this bit could not, if you like, indemnify the people doing this bit that would say that the building would not fall down if they started to lift this. So there was a long period of hiatus while we kind of debated the risks associated with this. And in the end of the day, the riggers just lifted it and the building didn't fall down. So that was okay. But it was a great resistance from the structural engineer who just would not take the risk of, because of the multiple, I mean, there's an infinite number of loads as this object is being raised up that get imposed upon the building. So we were reasonably confident that it wouldn't fall down. So, and it didn't. So this is Roger the elephant, who stayed in situ all the way through in his box. Stone cleaning. Historic Scotland will not permit exterior stone cleaning to be done at all in any circumstance. I think the amount of damage that was done to the old sandstone buildings when there was that period of everyone had to get their sandstone clean the city looks great, but it did do some damage. But we were permitted to stone clean internally, provided we used an appropriate means of doing it. So there was extra funding actually from a private philanthropic source who actually said the money must be spent in cleaning the interior stonework. So that's why there was some enthusiasm for this. So we were trying to remove the dirt, remove evidence of salts, streaks, runs, splashes, all that kind of stuff, and any paint that was already damaging it. But we had to do it without damaging or discoloring the stone. We wanted to bring the surface condition up and to carry out any repairs using proper materials. So we tested small areas, and if you're in the museum, you will actually see this little test piece. We left it like that so that people could see it. So it's a latex poultice. The manufacturer of the material is Arte Mundit, who are Belgian, I think. So we had an analysis carried out and did some testing. I'm just going to see if we can zoom this a bit. So you can see the before and the after. So it's a very impressive piece of work. And once I go back, I'll show you an even better one. So we did this analysis of this, and Robert Gordon University did a detailed analysis of the impact on the stone of this latex poultice. And it was there was very little residual ammonia left. There was no etching of the surface. The color was perfect. And even under an electron microscope, the impact of this latex was minimal. So we looked at various options. This is a different system, but it was too harsh on the fabric. Laser, we did try that, but can you imagine how long it would take to do a line a few millimeters long? A dental steaming machine was fine, but not again if you're doing a whole area. And the latex poultice was proven to be the most suitable. And that is the material being peeled back after it was applied. It's the most fantastic thing. It's probably one of the most dramatic transformations in the whole museum. And that's it. So this area here is what I was talking about earlier, where we got an artist, a set designer artist to touch up the very badly damaged space. And for the photograph is in the wrong direction because the worst damage was above here. So you don't really see it to best effect. So that's it after the stone has been cleaned. There's still a bit of builder's dust about, which takes me right back to the beginning. I don't think, again, I think this is looking the wrong way for the remedial paintwork. This is something which is really an incidental thing. This was never designed as part of it's not part of the collection. It was the brainchild of one of the designers at Event Communication, who one day said, wouldn't it be nice if there was expressive faces suspended in the museum? So she took photographs of bald-headed men in her office and asked them to basically, what's the word, gurn, and present a range of expressions that would show all sorts of characters. And it has become a bit of a trademark, I suppose. And again, it's something that was purely incidental. It was never intended as part of the project. And that is pretty much how it all ended up. It's quite something. So kind of, that's me, I think. How long was that? Quite long enough, I think. So if anyone's got any questions or would like to come back and challenge anything, I would be very interested to hear your comments. On the other hand, you may want to just go and get a cup of tea. So thank you very much for listening. And if you've got any questions, I would happily answer them.
No, thank you. That was really interesting. Excellent presentation.
Maureen.
Go for it, Maureen.
Well, go for it, yes. Just to say, George, that was really interesting. You know, it was really great to see how it's been transformed, and it really does look a beautiful building inside now, you know, and the access is so much better, you know, the various lifts and things, it's well laid out. I remember the building from long ago, and I just was going to ask you, was anything done with the spaces in the various towers? Because on the above that kind of second floor, there was a conservation department for many years, but they also had steps right up to the top of the towers, and they just used them for storage. They were horrible spaces to go into, and I was told when I first went in to watch out for the rats and the spiders. So I didn't go in too often. Did you do anything with those spaces?
No, I think, Maureen, you're probably talking about these.
Yes, that's right.
And what we found, these were not touched really at all. Again, because of the accessibility issues, we often have problems these days with single means of escape from spaces. Yes. So you can't really use a space like that other than very, very limited storage. You certainly couldn't use it as a workspace anymore, I would have thought.
No, no, right, interesting. Yes, thank you.
George, how long is the project?
George, the engineer.
Oh, hello, what?
Hi, it's Will.
Hello, George. Can I ask?
Who were the engineers?
I knew you'd ask me that. It's so long ago. I want to say Halcrow, but I'm not. I'm going to check that because it's. I knew you'd ask me that, Willie. You're a bad man. I'm going to do it. Just hold on a minute. Google is wonderful.
I don't worry about it. Did they get the stone from Lockerbriggs?
Yes, I think they did.
Right.
Well, yes, it is Lockerbriggs. I think there was the quarry was still operational.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm going to do this because I'm really just going to. I'm going to go team, see what happens. What does it say? That's an art. It's the usual thing. Alison Brown has written that.
Don't worry about it.
I know it will annoy me though. But anyway, they were the ones who had the difficulty in signing off the methodology for the suspension of the aeroplane.
Yeah.
You probably know more about that than I do.
Yeah, they're quite. Don't take the lie. You don't need to.
Well, yes, something like that.
Why didn't they just take the engine out of the aeroplane?
Say again?
Why didn't they just take the engine out of the aeroplane?
Authenticity, my boy. Authenticity.
That's a great reply.
George, we came back to Glasgow in 1969, and shortly after that, we went for lunch into the art galleries, and it was in one of these, up in the top floor of one of these towers, that they had this small lunch place. It was quite formal. I think we actually had, I can't remember very well, but I think we actually had a waitress. Anybody else remember it?
Uh-huh.
That must have been for the posh people.
It was a lovely view looking in all directions, you know, because the windows, I think, would be in 3 sides. Is that right?
Obviously, by the time we got in about it, it had been pretty much stripped out.
It only lasted for a short time. I think it was they were
right.
out.
Right. No,
We
I
were
mean,
lucky.
it's one of these projects where you just can't. We all look back on it very, very fondly, because the building is so important to Glasgow and Scotland, I suppose. I mean, I remember standing in front of a group of people, and I'm trying to think who it was. It might have been women in construction, believe it or not. And they were all standing on the main stairs, and I was waxing lyrical about this project. And I found myself being overcome because it was just so significant. You know, the comment about Margaret getting thrown out of the museum.
Yeah.
You know, we've all got stories of I think of Kelvingrove if we have been there at all. And it was one of these things that the contractor was determined to do it right. Building Design Partnership, who actually put this presentation together in large part, were the architects, and they didn't interfere with it. They were very sensitive to the requirements of the building. There was talk at one point of putting a glass lift right up from the main hall up the stairs, which would have resolved the problems very easily. But that's an easy out. We did it kind of the hard way by trying to find these shafts in walls and inserting lifts. The service lift for the collection was another huge challenge, Maureen. You know, there were some fairly chunky bits of art that we had to get in and out. And I remember vividly that we dug this massive hole and it filled with water, and you know, we had to say, how are we ever going to get this waterproof or watertight? Mm-hmm. And things like that as I look back on them, you begin to tremble, but by and large, it was just such a pleasurable experience to be associated with this project. If I had been, I remember, you know Lawrence Fitzgerald, Maureen. Yeah. Well, Lawrence took over the Riverside Museum. Yeah. And after I finished this, I was for a period the project manager in Riverside. And Lawrence was very enthusiastic about Riverside because he was from a transport background. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh no, Kelvingrove will never, you know, you'll never eclipse Kelvingrove with this. Oh, what do you mean? You know, he couldn't understand it. And I think you've got to be from Glasgow to understand it.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
That it's the iconic building of Glasgow as far as I'm concerned. Maybe that's because I never went to Glasgow Uni. I went to the back, you know. Yes. So anyway, it was great.
I always think it's been marvellous at Kelvingrove. Particularly if you go at the weekend, there's all sorts of people finding pleasure in it. You know, all, to be snobbish, all classes of people.
Absolutely.
Just finding something of interest in it and loving it.
To that extent, the aim of the city to diversify it has worked, I think, quite well.
Yes.
I think it was always accessible. You know, I don't think, you know, when I mean that, I mean accessible to people rather than being able to climb the stairs or whatever. Mm. But it just is there for everyone now. And I haven't been in for a while, so I don't know how the rotation of objects has gone, Maureen, whether you've been in there. Okay, thank you. That's fine.
I didn't realise they were thinking of doing that.
Well, interestingly, I don't know how. And there was I thought it was a stipulation of the Heritage Lottery Fund that they had to rotate 10% of the collection every year.
Really? That's interesting. Yes. It's my big bugbear. Yeah, I'm afraid. All the great Renaissance paintings, apart from 2, are hidden in storage and haven't been put back. It's just appalling, just terrible.
I am interested in your thoughts on this story-based approach, because that, it seems to me, is de rigueur now, that every museum has this approach, and I guess that alone ties you in terms of the breadth of the collection.
Rotating.
Would that be a fair comment? You know.
I mean, there's no reason not to show the best of the collection, the Renaissance art, North and Italian art, and you could weave plenty of stories. And,
yes.
And in fact, they did. They had a small but interesting display to explain the materials that are used in Renaissance painting. So, you know, there was some narrative that was possible and was provided, but that all of that has disappeared, and the labeling I just don't even want to mention. So I'm going to stay polite.
I think that was, yes. I mean that's I'm guessing that's where this idea of dumbing down has come from.
Yeah.
There was a real rigidity applied to the labeling, which I think was not particularly helpful.
No.
You know, to limit the word count to whatever, I think 300 words. It might not even have been that. In every situation is unnecessarily constraining, I think.
Yes. So.
Yeah, but it's fascinating.
Yes. I have very fond memories of working in Kelvingrove. It was a beautiful environment, you know, and lovely colleagues. But in the early 1980s, they transformed the natural history section. And they were taking out the old, very fusty, old-fashioned displays, and they actually put in really interesting displays instead that were full of narrative. You know, it was wonderful. But the few days it took to remove all the animals from the hall where Sir Roger is now and was then, was a real education in terms of me discovering how many rude swear words people could say. And I remember my boss saying, Maureen, come along. You know, they had a lot of natural historians and they had taxidermists, and they all needed to physically move things out of that space. And Roger wouldn't make it. And I have to say, the air was literally blue. And we were all laughing. We were watching from above. It was okay for us, but the swear words, I've never experienced it. And when they couldn't get Roger through the doorway, it was just a nightmare. And the giraffe was a nightmare. The standing giraffe, they had one that had its head down as if it was drinking water. But the tall giraffe, they couldn't get him round the corner because he was so long. And again, it was just very funny. And by the end, the head of natural history was not talking to anyone. A few days off afterwards, and we knew not to go anywhere near him. so I have fond memories of changes in the
yes. Yeah, it's brilliant. Anyway, once you've done a bit more of your exploring proper art, I'll give you one on the riverside. It's got some interesting
That's good.
contrast to this one.
Who's going to do the advert for next week then, please?
Yes, come on, Maureen. What we're going to get?
Oh, right. Yes, right. Well, we're just going to look at 10 paintings that if or when I go and see it, and we've seen it a few times now, you can book in advance to go and see. If I was going or taking someone, I would probably recommend these paintings. and they'll be very familiar to many of you, indeed, maybe all of you and things, but I just want to explain why I think they're worth looking at in some detail.
And these aren't the paintings that aren't being hung. These aren't the
Sorry?
ones. These aren't the ones that are hiding up in.
No, I'm explaining. There's no point in showing you the ones that are hiding. They're only the ones that are on display.
That's great.
There you are, folks. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
So I think everybody just wants to say a big thank you to George. That was
Yes, thank you, George.
Fantastic, yes.
Very good.
thanks very much, George. And
Thank you, George.
we look forward to the next time when we hear. Where is it next time? George.
For me,
Yes.
like Riverside Museum.
Oh, Riverside, yes, that'd be good.
Right.
George.
And next week, Maureen. Okay, folks. I think that's us. So
Thank
catch you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks
Bye.
very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
The clock for the quiet time.
Bye.
Yes.
And without further ado, adios.